Hello and welcome to the 8th lesson in our series on the first half of the Old Testament. I'm your instructor, Kerry Muhlestein, and today we're going to talk about Ruth and Samuel. These are fantastic books and great things we can learn from each one of them, and they're an important transition period in the story of the house of Israel in the Promised Land. We're going to start out with the book of Ruth, and let's just do a little bit of background on the book of Ruth. This story takes place in the period of the Judges. So what we have is a long kind of bunch of books that form a continuous history. You could argue it's Joshua through 2 Kings. Some would argue it's Deuteronomy through 2 Kings. The book of Ruth is in the middle of that, but it's not actually part of that history. We don't know who wrote it. It's put in the middle of those books because it's in between Samuel and the book of Judges, because it takes place in the time of the Judges, and Samuel is like the last of the Judges. So that's where it fits in historically. It's a beautifully written book. This author is incredible in the way he does things. There are so many things I love about this book. One really interesting thing about it is there are no major figures. There's not a king. There's not a prophet. There will be people who are major who descend from the people in this book, but it's a story about your average everyday Israelite during average everyday Israel. Times are mostly peaceful. We don't read about wars or anything like that. There is a famine, and that's fairly commonplace, where they have periods of drought, and it's very difficult. So that's going on. It's really just a slice of normal life. You have in there a guy named Elimelech, whose name means God is my king, his wife Naomi, whose name means sweet or pleasant, and Ruth and some of the others, we don't know what their names mean. They're from Moab. In any case, let's ask ourselves some questions. What should we learn from Ruth? What do we learn from the book of Ruth? And for the most part, and from Ruth herself, for the most part, we're going to just go through the text together. So we're familiar with the story. There's a famine in the area around Bethlehem, and so if you go just down the mountain and across the Jordan River and back up, or even just down in those plains where Moab is, they are not having a famine. There are probably some reasons why. There's a rain shadow that Bethlehem can be caught in and so on, but in any case, they're doing okay. So they go over there to Moab, and they're living there. It's Elimelech and Naomi and their two sons. And the two sons marry. One of them marries Ruth, and one of them marries a Moabitess named Orpah, and things are good. And then Elimelech dies, and both of his sons die. This is tragic in a number of ways. The society is set up in a way that your representation happens through men, not women, and so they're left without representation in society. They were farming, and it was rigorous work, and they weren't feeling that they were up to it physically and so on. This is a terrible thing. So Naomi decides the best thing is for her to go back to her people. But she tells Ruth and Orpah to stay. They both say, we'll go with you. Let's give Orpah credit. They both say, we will go with you, and we will help you. And Naomi tells them, no. If you're young enough, if you stay here among your people, you might be able to remarry. That's unusual, but it might happen. People might say, well, there's no family that they're really part of. They were Israelites and everything. Maybe this could happen for them. If you come with me, there's no way. I don't have any more sons. You're going to be seen as part of my family, but no more sons for you, so you're just not going to get remarried. And so Orpah agrees. But let's look at what we can learn from Ruth right away as we go to Ruth chapter 1. And these are probably the most famous verses in Ruth, but they're so incredibly important to understand the story. Verse 16, and Ruth said, entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Now listen to this. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. I want you to remember back when we talked about the covenant and ask how covenant is reflected in this. Remember that those phrases, my people, are phrases about covenant, and my God, or God being their God, are phrases about covenant. I think that Ruth is reflecting here that she has become or is becoming part of the covenant. That's something that was possible. People from other cultures could become part of the covenant. There's a process to go through and so on. I think that's what this is reflecting, and that's going to be an important element of this story as we go along. I think she's demonstrating incredible loyalty to Naomi. And I think that she is also talking about how she is willing to be part of this covenant, or maybe she's already part of that covenant. There's another element of this that I think we often don't notice. So let's remember, and we've talked about this a little bit before when we did the story of Judah and Tamar, and I just want to remind you of the levirate law of marriage. That's going to come to play in this story. So under the levirate law of marriage, let's remember that there is no 401k plan, there's no Social Security or anything along those lines. When you get too old to take care of yourself, you are just in trouble if there's not someone else who will take care of you. And the plan is that your children will take care of you. Now that's why the levirate law of marriage is important, because if a husband dies, then there's someone needs to take care of the widow until she has children that are old enough to take care of her. And if she doesn't have any children, then they're supposed to provide her with children so that they can grow up and take care of her. And so the brother-in-law will marry, or the closest male relative will marry and take care of that person so that they can be taken care of. But notice what is happening here. Naomi is saying, you can still get married and have someone to take care of you, but it's too late for me. I won't have anyone to take care of me. And what Ruth says is, I will take care of you. Now, she's going to have a more difficult time taking care of her, but she will take care of Naomi. But notice what's implied in there. They don't know that the story is actually going to change and Ruth is going to get married. They are all assuming Ruth will never get married. That means that Naomi will have someone to take care of her, but at some point, Ruth will be the one who is old with no one to take care of her. So what Ruth, in essence, is saying, in order to spare you that suffering, I'll go through that suffering. You'll be spared. I'll take the suffering upon myself. That is incredibly Christ-like. In fact, I think it's a symbol or a type of Christ. And remember that Christ is descended from Ruth. So we'll come back to that at the end of the story, but let's see right away the symbolism of Christ reflected in Ruth, this great heroine of the Bible. So we know they go across back to Bethlehem, and they are going to try and survive by gleaning, right? So I want to just show you some pictures. When we think of fields, we typically think of these great big fields, but the area around Bethlehem is just full of hills. And so the fields are actually small, like this, and you might get a whole bunch of little fields, maybe at the biggest a field like this, but this is unusual, all right? Now, we know she is going to survive by gleaning, and there's some fun things in here. So let's ask ourselves a couple of questions. What do they know? What do we know about Ruth's character, and what do we know about Boaz's character? Well, we can learn something about Ruth's character right away because we've already said she's going to stick with Naomi and take care of Naomi, and she's not afraid of hard work, so she's going to go out to the fields as soon as they get there and start to glean, and we'll talk about what that means in just a minute, but she's going to start to glean food so that she can feed both of them. Let's look at chapter 2, verse 2. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, Let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn. Corn means grain. Just translate that as grain. That's what it means in the King James Version. Ears of grain after him whose sight I shall find grace. So she's just going to go find somewhere who might be nice to her and let her glean in the field. And she said unto her, Go, my daughter. And she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And her hap was to light on, her hap, it's by chance, he's saying, but he does not mean by chance. The author intends for us to see this is not by chance. On a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was a kindred of Elimelech. All right, so we'll come back to that in a minute. For a moment, let's talk about what gleaning means. So let's go to Leviticus chapter 19, and we're going to read verse 9. And when ye reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of the harvest. And thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of thy vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and stranger. I am the Lord your God. So here's what is supposed to happen. As you are harvesting, there are a couple of things. You've got a little sickle, and you go along and you harvest, and some grains will fall to the ground. You're not supposed to pick that up. Leave those for people to come and pick up. The other element is that as you're coming to fields that even in those long, narrow fields, you have usually kind of square corners, but when you use a sickle, you make round motions. So that means that you're going to have a little corner left in each corner that isn't harvested. And think of how if your fields really are actually a whole bunch of little narrow fields rather than one big field, you have a lot of corners. Now, what you would normally do is just go one step further out and bring in that little corner, but the law of Moses says don't do that. Leave that for someone else. So the idea of gleaning, well, let's read one other thing from gleaning. We're going to go back and read Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19. So we're going to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19. And when thou cuttest down thine harvest in thy field, and hast forgot a sheaf in the field, thou shalt not go fetch it. It shall be for the stranger and the fatherless and for the widow, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hands. So there are a number of things you're supposed to do. You let the things that fall to the ground go to the ground. You leave the corners of the field. When you do the olive trees, you get the olives that you can, but then what people would normally do is shake the olive tree to get the last bit of stuff to fall down. You don't shake the olive tree. You're getting stuff from the vine for the grapes, so then you'd go back through and see what you missed. You don't go back through and see what you missed. And the principle is that you are leaving food for the poor. You're not just giving it to them. You're giving them a chance to go work for it, but there is an opportunity for them to get food. That's called gleaning, all right? And so we know something more about Ruth besides her loyalty, that she's a hard worker. This is hard work. She's going to go out and work to glean all this stuff. Now let's go back to the book of Ruth and read a little something that will teach us about Boaz. We get verse 4. And one of the things I love about the book of Ruth is you get lots of little things about just what everyday life is like. So we get to verse 4. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said unto the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless thee. That's their hello, hi, how are you? That's the way they greeted each other. We learned that just from this story. And verse 6, and the servant that was set over the reapers verse 5, then said Boaz unto his servant that was set over the reapers, whose damsel is this? And the servant that was set over the reapers answered and said, it is the Moabitish damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab. And she asked if she could reap there. We get verse 8. Then said Ruth unto Boaz, hearest thou not, my daughter? Go not to glean in another field, neither go from hence, but abide here fast by my maidens. Let thine eyes be on the field that they do reap, and go thou after them. Have I not charged the young men that they shall not touch thee? And when thou art athirst, go unto the vessels and drink of that which the young men have drawn. So can you see what he's doing for her? He's telling her, stick with us. You don't have to go glean a whole bunch of other places. You stick with us. My men will protect you, and you can drink from our well with the water we've drawn. So he's helping her, but it gets even better. Verse 10, then she fell on her face and bowed herself to the ground and said unto him, why have I found grace in thine eyes, that thou shouldst take knowledge of me, seeing I am a stranger, meaning a foreigner? And Boaz answered and said unto her, I love this, it hath fully been showed me all that thou hast done unto thy mother-in-law since the death of thine husband, and how thou hast left thy father and thy mother and the land of thy nativity, and art come unto a people which thou knewest not heretofore. Verse 12, the Lord recompense thy work, and a full reward be given thee of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust. Now remember that phrase. We're going to come back to that. The Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust. But you see, Boaz is impressed with her. He recognizes her loyalty and her covenant with Jehovah, and he respects that. So that tells you something about Boaz. Then we get some more interesting things. Verse 13, she's happy about finding favor, and so on. Verse 14, and Boaz said unto her, at mealtime come thou hither, and eat of the bread, and dip thy morsel in the vinegar. And she sat beside the reapers, and she reached her parched corn, and she did eat, and was sufficed, and left. So he's not only, and he tells his men, leave some extra for her. So leave some, he's making her life easier. He gets her to stay there, says you can drink our water. He has the men leave some droppings so it's easier for her to glean. Not only is she getting water from them, but she's getting some of the vinegar, but also this parched corn. So what it is that they will harvest a little bit of the grain before it's ripe, and then they cook it. So it has more sucrose in it when you do that, and it cooks and kind of pops. That's the parched corn, and they would give that to people to eat in the middle of the day because the sucrose, the natural sucrose, gives them energy to finish out the afternoon. And he's letting, but this is stuff he's giving to her, so that's at his cost, right? But he's giving it to her. So you learn about Boaz and what a great man he is as he's helping her do so well from the gleeping. And that's fantastic because we see in their interaction that they're both just godly, unselfish people who respect others who are godly and unselfish. It's a fantastic thing. Now, interestingly, Ruth goes home and Naomi sees how much she's brought. And we can do the math. We see how much she's brought, and we can look at rations of the day. We have texts that show us kind of how much a typical day's ration is and that kind of a thing. And we see that if she does this for a month, she's going to have enough for them to live off of pretty easily for a year. That's impressive for gleaning. She has brought home more than what Naomi expects. And when Naomi sees it, she's like, whoa, what happened? How did you bring home so much? So when Ruth tells her that she's been gleaning in Boaz's field, this is what Naomi says. We're in chapter 2, verse 20. And Naomi said unto her daughter-in-law, Blessed be he of the Lord, who hath not left off his kindness and living to the dead. The word is there actually is chesed, all right, who's not left off his chesed to the living and the dead. And Naomi said unto her, The man is near of kin unto us, one of our next kinsmen. Now that's important. That's really important for a number of ways. And notice how Naomi immediately recognizes this as chesed, not just for them, but for the dead, meaning her dead husband and her dead sons. Because one of the worst things that can happen in Israelite society is for your line to die out. But remember that the Levirate law is designed for that not to happen. Remember that under the Levirate law, let's say that you're the birthright child and your brother dies before having children. He's married but doesn't have children. Then you are supposed to have a specific kind of marriage, a Levirate marriage with his wife, your sister-in-law, where you will help his sister-in-law get pregnant, and then the child is not your child, it's your dead brother's child. And his line does not die out, and he inherits everything that the brother was supposed to inherit. So the responsibility falls to the closest kinsman to be this Levirate husband. Now we'll learn that Boaz is not actually the closest kinsman, he's the second closest kinsman. But there's something important that Naomi realizes when she recognizes you happen to go to Boaz's field, and Boaz has respect for you. She sees this as the hand of God to preserve that line. She is looking for the Levirate marriage to happen, to have that line preserved, and for them to be taken care of. She recognizes this immediately. There's another law that comes to play in here. It's in the book of Leviticus in chapter 25. And we'll just explain it here. It's an incredibly important law, and the symbolism of Christ is so potent here. And remember when we talked about the law of Moses and all the symbolism that teaches us about Christ, this is one of the laws that is most important for that. In Israelite society, besides there being no 401k or pension plan or Social Security, there's no Chapter 11. You can't declare bankruptcy. So in an agricultural society, people often have to borrow. The small-time farmer often has to borrow to be able to plant, and then at the end of a harvest, if it's a good harvest, he can pay off that debt. But of course, there will be years where the rain doesn't come as much, or there's strong hot winds or something, hail comes too early, you don't have a good harvest, and you can't pay off your debt. You can't just say, I'm bankrupt. If you can't pay your debt, then your land is seized to pay that debt. If that doesn't pay the debt, then your children are seized to pay that debt. If that doesn't pay the debt, then your spouse, your wife, is seized. And if the idea is that the male will still be available to keep earning to pay them back. But if that doesn't pay off the debt, then the husband is seized. Then the debt isn't going to get paid back, but at that point, they're all in bondage for forever. Well, there's a system where every 7 years they're let go. That is another part of the law of Moses. But there's another alternative. And this is part of why the birthright child is given twice as much. The birthright child gets a double inheritance because he's supposed to, A, take care of the parents, B, take care of anyone who dies, right? So that be the Levirate husband for the widow and orphans. And C, if anyone in the family gets sold into bondage or their land is sold into bondage, they have the option to buy it back. They can't be refused. They are what the Hebrew word is goel. We translate it as redeemer. If they have both the willingness and the ability to buy back the land or the people first, then land, they cannot be refused. However much the person enjoyed having the land or enjoyed having the servants, it doesn't matter. If a close kinsman, the closest kinsman, has the right to redeem them. This is exactly why Christ is called the Redeemer of Israel, or Jehovah is called the Redeemer of Israel. He redeems them from bondage in Egypt, and that's when he gets that title, the Redeemer of Israel. So Naomi also recognizes that as their close kinsman, and in fact the word in there is goel, as their close goel, a kinsman redeemer is how we should translate that. And you can only redeem kinsmen. So when Christ is the Redeemer of Israel, it's because they are his people. They've made covenant with him. He's begotten them. They become his family. He is their kinsman redeemer, right? Jehovah can redeem Israel because of that. Naomi recognizes that Boaz is a potential goel for them, so that not only can he perform this levirate marriage, but he can regain their land and give their family the chance to continue on. It's a powerful thing that she realizes. So she says, you just keep going with Boaz, right? So we're now going to see what we could term the redemption of Ruth. So we get in chapter 3, Naomi the schemer. Verse 1, Naomi, her mother-in-law, said unto her, my daughter, shall I not seek rest for thee, that it may be well with thee? And she tells her, you go to Boaz when he's finished threshing. Okay, so what happens is you thresh, getting all the kernels out from the chaff. You blow the chaff away. You do this on a threshing floor. But now this is when people are going to want to come and steal your stuff, because they don't want to steal it when all that hard threshing work still has to be done. But when you've got just the kernels, that's when people are going to come steal your stuff. So there's a tradition that the person who owns it will sleep on the threshing floor where all the grain is until you can gather it in. So Naomi says to Ruth, he's going to be sleeping alone on the threshing floor. You go and lay next to him. And in fact, even she's going to have him use some of his robes to cover her, and that will wake him up, and then propose to him that he should be your goel, your redeemer. And that's exactly what happens. We get, starting in chapter 3, the story of that happening. And verse 9, he wakes up and says, who art thou? And she answered him, I am Ruth, thine handmaid. Now listen to this verse. All right. I am Ruth, thy handmaid. Spread therefore thy skirt over thy handmaid, for thou art a near kinsman. Thou art a goel. All right. But there's another Hebrew word here that we should know about. The word is kanaf. And the word kanaf means wing, but it's also used for a robe, or a skirt or a robe, or the part of a robe. All right. And that's what she says. She says, spread therefore thy kanaf over thine handmaid, over me, for thou art a goel. Well, do you remember what Boaz had said to her? He said to her that she should be blessed of Jehovah, under whose wings thou art come to trust. Now she, in essence, says, spread your wing over me, or in other words, she's saying, be Jehovah's wing. I've come to trust in Jehovah's wings. Be the wing for me. Take care of me. Be our goel, our redeemer. And his response, blessed art be thou, O Lord, my daughter, for thou hast showed more kindness in the latter end than in the beginning, inasmuch thou followest not young men, whether poor or rich. So he's saying, I know I'm older. I'm happy you are coming to me as a goel rather than going after guys your own age and so on. But then he tells her that there is a closer redeemer, but he tells her to stay the night there, and he uses a word that means sleep here that doesn't have sexual connotation, so we know that it's not that. Just stay here, and I'll make sure you're taken care of. And then the next morning he gives her lots of food and sends her home. And I love this. This tells you something of Boaz's reputation and what Naomi knows about Boaz, because we get to chapter 3, verse 18. And when Ruth tells Boaz, or when Ruth tells Naomi what has happened, we get verse 18. Then said she, sit still, my daughter, until thou know how the matter will fall, for the man will not be in rest until he have finished the thing this day. Right? She says, oh, Boaz said he was going to take care of it today. Don't worry, he'll take care of it today, right? That tells you something about Boaz. I love that description. Now, the problem is that there is a closer kinsman who has the right to be the goel first before Boaz. So Boaz goes to set this up so that it will work out just right. So he goes to the gate. That's where business is traditionally handled. He finds the elders of the city that can handle this kind of business. And then when he sees this closer kinsman come in, he says, ho, such a one, all right? So because he's not going to marry Ruth, the Bible writer will not even give this guy the dignity of telling us his name. He's not going to give him a name. Instead, he gives us their version of what's his face, all right? It's such a one. And he calls such a one, come on over, and he says, hey, there's this field. Naomi's field is available. You're the closest kinsman. You can have it if you want. And the guy says, yeah, great, I'd like to have it. And then Boaz says, oh, but by the way, with it, of course, would come Naomi, and he knows he's not going to have children through Naomi, but also Ruth. And that would mean that you or one of your sons will have to have Ruth as a wife, and she'll have children, and the children will get that inheritance. And then this guy says, okay, hang on. I would have to use my resources to buy the field from whoever now owns it, but then my children don't get that field. Ruth's children, who won't be considered my children, will get that field. So that actually takes away from my children's inheritance. And he says, nope, I'm not going to do it. And he does this by this interesting ritual where he takes the shoe off. And now that's the one law in the book of Moses that has public humiliation as part of it. If someone refuses to be a redeemer, then the person who wanted to be redeemed is supposed to, they're supposed to take their shoe off, and then the person can spit on them because this is such a terrible thing, you're not willing to redeem them. I think the symbolism of the shoe, typically lacing on your shoe means you're ready to go do whatever you're supposed to do. So I would guess taking it off means you're not willing to do what you're supposed to do. So he takes his shoe off and says, I won't redeem them. And Boaz has set this up just perfectly so that now he's the next closest redeemer, and he will buy the field and be the levirate husband for Ruth and Naomi. And notice that when they do have children, that Naomi speaks of the children as being her son's children, and in some ways of being her children. But note this also, we're in chapter 4, verse 18. Now these are the generations of Pharez. So now let's go to 17. Verse 17, and the women, her neighbors, gave it a name, saying, there is a son born to Naomi, and they called his name Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David, right? So Ruth is the great-great-grandmother of David. And of course, Christ is also descended from this line. So I think it's important to ask ourselves a couple of questions. This comes about both because of the righteousness and the willingness of these two great individuals to do what they should do rather than thinking of themselves. Boaz has the right to redeem her, and remember the redemption laws that we talked about in chapter 25 and Leviticus 25, Deuteronomy 25 and Leviticus 25, because she is kinsman and part of the covenant. If she is not part of the covenant and not part of the family, she can't be redeemed, but she is redeemed because of that. And we should recognize that the credit goes to God, but the child is Naomi's and so on. Really, it's Ruth's, but it's thought of as Naomi's, and it's the continuation of that line. But I want to ask this question and also talk about the symbolism. Is there a connection between the two Levirate law chapters, the two that we've done, Genesis 38, with the Levirate law being applied to Judah and Tamar, and the story of Ruth with the Levirate law being applied to Ruth? And note that Boaz and Naomi are descendants of Tamar, and David will be a descendant of Ruth and Tamar, so Christ is a descendant of Ruth and Tamar. I do not think it's a coincidence that Christ is descended from these Levirate marriages, which, remember, is a law that is designed to take care of people who are unable to take care of themselves. And I also think it's not a coincidence that he is descended from someone who was redeemed because she was willing to make a covenant with Jehovah. Because this is what Christ does for us. As we become part of his family by making a covenant, he will take care of us in the ways we can't take care of ourselves, and he will redeem us. It's powerful symbolism from this great heroine and this great hero, and through whom Christ will be descended and be all of our Redeemer and take care of us. Now, let's move on to the next part of this lesson, which is the story of Samuel and the book of Samuel. Samuel is a very important figure, and he is also in the period of the Judges, probably just barely after Ruth, right? So we've got just like 3 generations from Ruth to the story of David, and Samuel is an old man by the time of David. So he's just maybe around Ruth's age or just a little bit after and so on, so from this same time period. Let's talk about the book of Samuel. First of all, we don't know who wrote the book. The Talmud claims that Samuel is the author, but I highly doubt it since he's not alive for like the last third to half of the book. He probably did some writings, and then other people compiled them, just like Mormon does in the Book of Mormon. Let's also talk about the book division. We have it as 1st and 2nd Samuel. The Talmud, which is Jewish commentary on the Bible, it records just 1 Samuel. The notes by the Masoretes, who are the people who give us the text that we currently use, the Hebrew text that we use for the Bible, they say it's also 1 Samuel. The Dead Sea Scrolls version, there's only 1 Samuel, but when you get to the Greek version, it's divided into 2, and that's probably because it's longer. Greeks use vowels. The Hebrew didn't use vowels, so it lengthens out how long it is. They're also going to start making books rather than scrolls and so on. It probably just became simple to divide it into 1st and 2nd Samuel. That probably also applies to Kings. So just read 1st and 2nd Samuel as if it were one book. That's the point of all of that, all right? Again, we don't know who wrote it, but we do believe they're inspired, and this is an inspired book that we should learn from. Let's also talk about Samuel as the last judge and the first prophet. And by that, I don't mean, we know that Adam was the prophet, first one that we know. He's the first prophet. But we're going to get this tradition of prophets that advise kings and advise the culture in kind of a new society in Israel. So he's going to be that because he's the last judge. Right? He is the last of the judges, and then kings will be the rulers after this. And so he becomes the first prophet under that system of kings, so much so that Christ will say to the Pharisees when he's talking to them from Samuel to Zechariah, and he speaks of Samuel as the first prophet, right? So he is thought of as the last judge, the first prophet. He's an incredibly important figure in Israelite religious history. And of course, his story starts with his mother, with Hannah. Remember that Hannah is unable to have a child. We see this happening a lot, don't we? She's unable to have a child, and her husband has 2 wives, and the other wife has children, and this is such an important thing in Israelite society to be able to have children that this is just a terrible burden for Hannah to not have children. And so she goes to the temple or the tabernacle where Eli is the high priest, and she is praying to have a child, and she's rocking back and forth and praying, so much so that Eli thinks she's drunk, but she says she's not drunk. And in fact, what she promises God is that if he will allow her to get pregnant and to have a child, that she will have that child become a Nazarite, take a Nazarite vow, and serve in the temple. She won't raise the child, just only until he's weaned. She might wait till he's a little older to wean him. I don't know. But she will take care of the child until he's weaned, and that would mean basically until he can survive without his mother. And then she will give him to the temple where he will serve in the temple. That's a difficult vow to make and to keep. But she makes and keeps it so that when Hannah is blessed, the Lord listens to her prayer, and she has the child. And we could just spend really hours just on that part of the story. But when she has the child, she does bring him to Eli, and he will serve in the temple. And I think this is more difficult than we recognize because we get this one little story in here that tells us that every year she brings a little coat for Samuel. She makes him a little coat every year. She spent her year, and she has other children. This opens her womb, and then she has other children. But you get the idea how much she misses Samuel, that she spends the year every year making a coat to come and give him so he can feel like I'm guessing, so he can feel like his mother loves him and is hugging him and taking care of him. It's a fantastic story, right? Now, Eli is having a problem, and these two things go together, these two stories. Eli has sons who are not righteous. And they're slated, they're high priests and slated to become the high priest like he is, that will run the temple and so on when he dies. But they're not righteous. They're bringing in, first of all, they're fornicating or adultery. They're probably married, so it's probably adultery. They're bringing foreign women into the temple to do their adulterous acts. They are taking meat from the people in ways that they're not supposed to when they bring meat for offerings. The priests are supposed to get some meat to eat, but they're making sure they get the best portions of meat rather than those going to the sacrifice. They're getting the best portions to eat and so on. So they're doing all sorts of things. And Eli, he kind of gets after him a little bit, but he's not, when they don't change, he's not willing to remove them from office. He's supposed to. They are profaning the tabernacle and the office of high priest, and it's unthinkable that when he dies that they would become the high priests. One of them would be the high priest, and they'd be terribly wicked people doing this, but Eli just can't get himself to remove them from office because they're his sons. So he is not willing to let God prevail most in his life. He is putting his sons first instead of God, and we get in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 29, God saying to him, "Wherefore kick ye at my sacrifice and at mine offering, which I have commanded in my habitation, and honorest thy sons above me, to make yourselves fat with the chiefest of all the offerings of Israel, my people." So you see what God is saying, that because he won't remove his sons from office, he clearly loves his sons more than he loves God. So we get in the next verse, "Wherefore the Lord God of Israel saith, I said indeed that thy house and the house of thy father should walk before me forever. But now the Lord saith, Be it far from me, for them that honor me I will honor, and they that despise me shall be lightly esteemed." So he's telling him the high priestly office will not continue through your family. It's going to be taken from you. And this brings us up to the call of Samuel. We know why Eli is rejected, because he's honoring the sons above God. And so as a result, instead Samuel will be called, and he will become the high priest. But it happens in a really fascinating way. So let's read this story. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 3, and we hear that God is calling Samuel, and Samuel keeps thinking he's asleep, and he keeps thinking it's Eli that calls him. So he comes in and he says, "Eli, did you call me?" And he says, "No, go back to bed." And he keeps hearing him calling him. So finally, we get verse 10. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 10. And the Lord came, let's go verse 9. "Therefore Eli said unto Samuel, Go, lie down, and it shall be, if he call thee, that thou shalt say, Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. So Samuel went and lay down on his place. And the Lord came and stood and called as at other times, Samuel, Samuel. Then Samuel answered, Speak, for thy servant heareth." All right, now, that's a phrase that is just worth memorizing. You could either memorize, "Speak, for thy servant heareth," or the way Eli said it, I like that even better, "Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth." Meaning, and the idea is, that you're hearing, you're listening and ready to do. This should be our attitude. We should memorize this so deeply that it sinks into our heart. It's part of who we are, so that we know whenever the Lord prompts us in any way, we are just saying, Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. We will go and do whatever you ask of us, right? And this is how Samuel is called, both as the prophet and as the new high priest. Now, there's an important element here that in Eli accepting and knowing, and I want to highlight this by going to section 43. Verses 3 through 4, and I think we'll see there's a principle in section 43 that this is the only time that I can think of where we see this principle actually enacted. So in section 43, there are a number of people who are not so sure that Joseph Smith really is still the prophet. They think he may be a fallen prophet and so on, and this is what God has to say about that. Section 43, verse 3. "And this ye shall know assuredly, that there is none other appointed unto you to receive commandments and revelations until he be taken, if he abide in me." And by taken, you mean die. Verse 4, "But verily, verily, I say unto you, that none else shall be appointed unto this gift, except it be through him. For if it be taken from him, he shall not have power except to appoint another in his stead." So what God is saying is that if he does become a fallen prophet, no one else is authorized to appoint a new prophet. The fallen prophet will appoint the new prophet. If he becomes a fallen prophet, he won't have the ability to do anything else except appoint the new prophet. Now let's go back and look at this story. God is calling Samuel, but Samuel doesn't recognize it's God. Eli is the one who recognizes that what's coming to Samuel is from God, and he tells Samuel, find out what God has to say. And so that's what happens. And in verse 10, Samuel answered, "Speak, for thy servant heareth." Verse 11, the Lord said to Samuel, "Behold, I will do a thing in Israel." And he tells him, "You will be the next prophet." And I'm sure this is hard for Samuel, who's basically been raised by Eli. Eli is in some ways his father. This is going to be hard for Samuel to say. So the next morning, in verse 15, Samuel lay until the morning and opened the doors of the house of the Lord, and Samuel feared to show Eli the vision. Then Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son, and he answered, Here am I. And he said, What is the thing that the Lord hath said unto thee? I pray thee, hide it not from me. So he seems to know what it's going to be. And verse 18, and Samuel told him every whit and hid nothing from him. Now listen to this. And he said, It is the Lord, let him do what seemeth him good. So at the beginning and at the end, it's Eli who says, This is from God. We'll accept it. In the middle, it's the transition of Samuel getting the word and telling it to Eli, but Eli is the one who recognizes it. I think we see acted out here what we're taught in section 43. Now, let's look at one other important thing. We've talked in lessons past about the Abrahamic sacrifice. We talked about it with Abraham and Isaac. We talked about it with Jacob. I think we see the Abrahamic sacrifice happening here, and we see it both happening and not happening. We see Eli is unable to, or not unable, but unwilling to make the Abrahamic sacrifice. He does come to a point where he needs to choose between those whom he loves most besides God, and he chooses those others, right? He chooses his children. He loves his children more than God. He is not willing to sacrifice them because of his love for God. He's just not willing to go through with it. Now, contrast that with Hannah, who has the child that she has always, always prayed for. And she is willing to give that child up to God. She keeps the Abrahamic sacrifice, and so it is incredibly fitting that it is her son, who is both that sacrifice and who is the descendant of someone who keeps the Abrahamic sacrifice, that becomes the high priest, and that will lead Israel into this period of righteousness. Now, there's one other verse that is worth reading here, and then we'll start to wrap up. And it's the verse that describes Samuel as he grows up. He's kind of like Jesus. We just get one verse to describe the growing up period. We're still in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 19. And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and he did let none of his words fall to the ground. That's really incredible. He did let none of his words fall to the ground. You can actually read that two different ways. You can mean that as God speaks, his words, they come into Samuel's ear and into his heart rather than falling to the ground. So everything God says, Samuel does. And I think that's the primary meaning here, because we've already seen, speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. This is the characteristic that will define Samuel. But you could also say, because the antecedents and the pronouns are ambiguous here, you could read this to mean whatever Samuel says, his words don't fall to the ground, they go up to God, and God hears and honors them. I think both are intended, because the way this works is that if you hear God, then he will hear you. And there's an important principle that is demonstrated here that I think is worth really thinking about. It's the idea that when we receive something from God and act on it, we'll get more. But when we don't receive from God and we don't act on it, then we lose what we have. And this is best represented by drawing you. So this is a picture of you here. You can see I'm an incredible artist here. And so this is a picture of you. And what we want is for you to become full of light and truth. So we're going to draw on this story. We're going to draw on like Isaiah 28 and the line upon line, precept upon precept thing. And the reception of light and truth the way it's taught in section 93, and that you go from grace to grace and you receive light and truth until you receive a fullness of light and truth. So we all want to receive light and truth. And of course, the only way we really receive light and truth is from the Holy Ghost, which is best symbolically represented as an IV. Right? So what happens is that the Holy Ghost gives you some light and truth, and you receive light and truth. And if you act on that light and truth, then you'll get more light and truth. And if you act on that light and truth, then you'll get more light and truth. The problem is that at some point we all get some little bit of light and truth, something that the Holy Ghost tells us that we don't like. It goes against our favorite sin or something along those lines, and so we don't act on it. Well, that's like putting a clamp on the IV, and the problem is that then not only do we stop receiving more light and truth, but we lose the light and truth that we have. Fortunately, that never, ever has to be the end of the story. Not ever. God is always willing to let us try again. He says, return unto me. In fact, it's one of the most oft-repeated phrases in the Old Testament. Turn or return unto me. I believe that at any time that you will set aside some time and ask the Lord, and you could do it right now, you could do it Sunday, you could do it on Fast Sunday, whatever works for you. But set aside some time and ask the Lord and say, what bit of light and truth do I have that I'm not obeying? That the Spirit will whisper to you some little bit of light and truth that you know that you're not acting on. And then if you act on it, you take the clamp off and you get more light and truth, and you act on that, you get more light and truth, you act on that, you get more light and truth until you receive a fullness of light and truth. That's the way that this principle acts. All right? So Samuel becomes the great chief high priest and judge over all of Israel. It's one of the few times where we have a judge that is over all of Israel, and he leads them to spiritual heights. He comes in when they're at that spiritual depth, and he leads them to new heights. Under Samuel, they start to find it wasn't under Samson that they started to gain land from the Philistines and started to overcome the Philistines. It's under Samuel, under that priest, not under the great warrior, right? And they have all sorts of great things that are happening under Samuel. But the problem is that the people are too influenced by the world around them. Now, I want you to start to ask yourself how we see this amongst us as a people today and how you see it amongst yourself as an individual, as a covenant individual today. How are we too affected by the world around us? Because the people want to win in battles the same way everyone else is winning. And so they say, look, all of the other nations around us have kings, and those kings lead them in battle. We want a king to lead us in battle. And it's very clear that they are doing this because everyone else is doing it. Sometimes we underestimate how much we're affected by the way the world around us acts, and we just want to be like them, right? There's surely some way you can think of in your life that the social pressures of the world, the way the world says, this is good, this is bad, that it's affecting you and you are rejecting God. And that's how both God and Samuel read this. God tells Samuel, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me when they say they want a king. I want to be their king, but they want to be like everyone else, so they want a worldly king. They're rejecting me. We reject God. There's some way in your life that you are rejecting God by instead accepting the values of the world. Try and think of how that happens. And here's the lesson that you should learn from this. Samuel warns them, if you get a king, all sorts of bad things are going to happen, and he gives them a list of bad things that are going to happen. He warns them of that, all right? We also know that part of what's going on here is that Samuel's children are also being wicked, just like Eli's children. What does Samuel do about his children? We don't actually know. I will assume that he did remove his children from office because we don't read about them in the future. We read about other people being in that high priest position, and because God doesn't remove Samuel from office. But that's part of what feeds them into wanting a king, as they see some problems with this, but it's mostly this idea of wanting to be like everyone else. And so Samuel gives them this list of things that will go wrong if they want a king, and they say, we want it anyway, and God gives it to them. And then thunder and lightning comes and they're scared, but it's too late. They're going to get a king. So here's a lesson to learn from that. We can look, and we won't read through all of these, but here's a list of the warning Samuel gives, what will happen when they have a king, and you will see that every single one of them happens. Every single one. All right? That's a great lesson to learn, because in the end, Israel finally had a righteous judge over all of Israel, and because they wanted to be like everyone else, they rejected that, and the prophecy of what would happen when they did reject it happened every whit. And we should remember then, identify what way you're not letting God prevail most in your life, or in other words, in what way you're rejecting God in favor of the world, and recognize that if that doesn't change, then there are all sorts of bad things that will come from that. All of the covenant reversals, all sorts of things. But if you can change it, then all of the covenant blessings will come. That's one of the great lessons that we can learn from the story of Samuel. If we will not let any of God's words fall to the ground, and if we will make the Abrahamic sacrifice and let God prevail most in our lives, rather than letting the world prevail over God in some instances, if we'll let God prevail, then we can be led by God himself.